Okay. Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce you today to our next panelists and our next panel on a political visual, Indigenous Feminisms in the Art. This panel features my dear friend and former colleague at Smith College, Nancy Marie Mithlo, who's a professor of gender studies at UCLA, and my new friend, Professor Basuli Deb, who's a professor of English at my alma mater, CUNY, Queens College. Our moderator will be Professor Mona Hassan, who's a member of the Editorial Advisory Board for Meridians and an associate professor of religious studies, history, and international and comparative studies at Duke University. However, we are once again having technical difficulties, so Professor Hassan will be joining us as soon as she is able to get back on board. But I will get us started because I don't want to delay this important conversation. So I'll just start by asking you both to, if you could, for our audience who may not have yet read The Reader, which is available for purchase, there's a button at the bottom of your screen, or your articles when they initially came out in Meridians. If you could just give us a brief summary of what your articles were about, and then reflect for us on why Meridians was a proper home for those essays that you wrote. What made you send it to this journal, and how has Meridians continued to work in the field that you are addressing in your essay? I'll start with Nancy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Meridians. Thank you to Smith College. Thank you to my colleagues. It's such a joy to be here. And just seeing everyone's face is inspiring to me. Yesterday, seeing Ruth Simmons, who had hired me way back in 2001, so inspiring. Her story in many ways is my story, so I felt reflected and seen. And so what a gift for all of us. My name's Nancy Marie Mithlo, and as Ginetta said, I'm a professor here at UCLA. I am speaking to you from the homelands of the Tongva and the Gabrielino peoples. And when I think back on the time at Meridians and I reflect on Ruth Simmons' comments yesterday about the impossibility of any of this happening, right? You know, and the expectations that exist that we have all struggled with. I would just want to tell a really brief story about it because I'm kind of a storyteller and I'll keep it short. But my daughter went to law school and became a law librarian. And part of her exercise was to do a family genealogy. And she shared with me that for 5 or maybe even 7 generations on my mother's side, that we were all educators. And so my mom is from East Tennessee and became a professor at Auburn where she met my father. But, you know, it seemed like such a long line of people devoted to education. And I shared this with one of my work colleagues at the university who asked, well, was that your dad? So my heritage, my native heritage, I'm Chiricahua Apache. Our tribe is the Fort Sill Chiricahua Warm Springs Apache tribe. We're located both in Oklahoma and in New Mexico. And she said, oh, that's on your dad's side. And I said, well, no, that would have been impossible because of our history. And so trying to translate the history of colonization, of genocide on American soil has really framed my whole, I think, experience as a scholar. And, you know, just relating that my grandfather was born as we used to say prisoner of war, and now I say political prisoner indefinitely detained in the United States. That was just my grandfather's generation, right? We were being hunted like dogs when Smith College opened, and constantly kind of having that idea of we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, you know, and how do you translate that history? And so I think for myself, I'm conceptualizing this journey as one of generations, that I am just simply someone who's carrying a seed to the next generation. And so Meridians for me, if I had a metaphor, it would be soil. You know, it's actually not about my experience at all. It's not about even me as an individual person. It's just that we keep carrying this ability to be able to speak and talk with independence and truth. And how much of an impossibility that is. And And I think Meridians, what it gave me was the transnationalism part. I was so fortunate in 2005 to be a part of a group called the Future of Minority Studies. And if you don't know about this, look it up. There's a series of books there. And so my publication ended up coming out of that initiative. It was Mellon funded. I think we need more of that Mellon money. So if anyone on the call knows how to get that money, let us know. We know what to do with it. And really having a crash course as an early scholar with Beverly Guy Sheftall and Chandra Mohanty on transnational feminisms. I mean, this was all a new language for me. You know, this was something that I had not been introduced to. It wasn't part of my worldview. And so to be able to feel like that could be part of my language is what inspired my piece for Meridians. And really, I was reading it over last night. And, you know, when we read our old work, I'm just like, girl, get over yourself. Get to your point. Make it shorter. You know, it seems cumbersome to me now. Like I really wanted to, you know, like a good citizen, check every box. But I was really just trying to make sense for the next generation. Again, it's not about me. Like, why were the women that in my research, who they're so primarily Native women, why did they reject feminism and really just wholeheartedly reject it? You know, why were our communities known as being separatist, you know, or nationalist? You know, these derogatory tribalist, you know, these are all seen as derogatory things. And I was just trying to make sense of that moment. And now, just to get to the part of like, what part of it is it for me now? I was trying to use some classic feminist terms. I was trying to use intersectionality, right? I was trying to use complementarity. And honestly, those are not part of my academic vocabulary. They just aren't. And so where I sat with this, and I'll finish up with this, is that I was more interested in this idea of like embodied and enacted knowledge. And I think in the essay, I termed this, I'm looking at defining moments of conflict. I'm looking at Trask, who talks about historically situated frames of reference, enacted knowledge. Henrietta Moore, way back when, social arenas to initiate personal strategies and make political claims. So, you know, my work actually went in a kind of a different direction. I made a statement about this almost impossibility of bridging what I was seeing as feminism in the arts and maybe more hegemonic feminisms. And then I kind of moved on and just started doing a lot of projects and theorizing those projects and not worrying about the language anymore. So now my graduate students will often say, like, Nancy, like, I think you're doing feminism, but you never use that word, you know? So I'm curious if others have had that experience. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm grateful for you all, and I'll step back now. But thank you, Ginetta, for the question.
Thank you, Nancy. I think a lot of that also is pre and post tenure stuff, right?
Oh my gosh.
To qualify, to be allowed to stay into the party. And then once we're in the party, we start changing the guest list. Basuli, can I please turn it over to you and ask for your reflections on the essay then and now?
Yeah, so I would like to start by acknowledging my gratitude to the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia and the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers. I'm a visiting scholar there in addition to being a CUNY faculty, and these are the two places which actually support my feminist work. I teach in the English department at CUNY, but my very deep gratitude to Meridians, to Smith College, and to Duke University Press for publishing us again. I think, you know, I'm going to follow the trajectory which Professor Mithlo has set for this panel. And if you don't mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal and professional genealogy and then trace it to the article, okay? So it's a very, you know, I think it's a trajectory which is very common to students in English departments here who come from India. I did my bachelor's and master's in British literature, actually, and then moved on to anti-colonial and post-colonial literature much later. And I went to a very elite institution. It was very much part of a British colonial legacy, Presidency College. It was taught by English faculty who were Oxford scholars. But then I read an article on Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye at a time where Indian libraries were saturated with British material, only on British literature, very little on American literature, leave alone African-American literature. And I was so intrigued by Morrison's imagination that captured the racialized pain of this little Black girl yearning for a pair of blue eyes, which she can never have. I finished my master's in British literature and moved to Jadavpur University, which was a similar institute. But there I worked across the English department and women's studies program to specialize in Black feminism, and then ended up writing my MPhil dissertation on Toni Morrison. Now, why my MPhil coursework had actually introduced me to post-colonial literature. And then I proposed a very ambitious project for my PhD in India, which proposed to forge a dialogue between the fields of post-colonial African-American studies. And my advisor, who was trained for her doctoral degree at the University of Florida, just, raised her hands in despair and said, "You can't find this kind of material. I'll write you a very strong letter, apply to the United States." Once I came here, I narrowed my focus on the advice of my committee to post-colonial literature, because there was just the two fields were at loggerheads at that point. In particular, there was a lot of challenge about the post-colonial literature from African-American studies, which still is there. And then I ended up writing my dissertation on women and militancy, subtitled Narratives from Guatemala, India, and South Africa. My grandfather, I do want to mention a little about my background and its connection to post-colonial literature. My grandfather and great uncle had been leaders in the anti-colonial movement in India and were political prisoners under the British Empire. And my grandmother had narrowly escaped life imprisonment as a college student active in the resistance. In a lot of ways, that dissertation was an evocation to her and her women friends in the movement, whose stories were repressed in the official history of India dominated by male freedom fighters. So while I was doing my doctoral degree, September 11 happened. And though I did not change the trajectory of my research, when I turned it into a book, I added 3 more chapters to it. One on the war on terror, another on Palestine and Israel, and a third on Algeria. My Meridians piece on Egypt is not only an outcome of this branching out into Middle East and North African studies, but also the hard negotiation as an overseas student of color, and later as a faculty of color, with discourses and practices of imperialist feminism within women's and gender studies departments. It was also a hard negotiation with the violent repression of transnational feminist work, a large part of which is done by immigrants of color. And that repression is happening not only at the level of the administration, but by feminist and gender studies scholars. And I encountered this in Nebraska, in a climate of increasing nationalism and racial supremacy, viciously hostile to international and immigrant faculty. So that, I wanted to lay this piece and, kind of embed this. When I was writing this, actually, they had blocked, like, the level of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia was at its peak. We are talking about it on the coast now. I had seen this, like, as soon as I went there. And they had blocked our immigration, selectively blocked the immigration of Chinese and Indian faculty, whereas everyone else was allowed to move forward. So that was the time I was writing this piece.
So Thank you both for sharing those personal and professional genealogies, and really, showing how the two are so deeply intertwined for most of us who do this work. And in fact, of course, one reflects on one's own trajectory and what brought us here. And I hear a shared theme in your stories and in my own families, which I won't bore you with. But is that very often we are the harvest of empire, as Juan Gonzalez put it in his book about Latino immigration to the United States, right? We're here because you were there. And how our family stories, our family experiences of the violence of settler colonialism, of international or global colonialism and imperialist colonialism, and interventionism in Latin America, in the case of my family, how the violence of those histories and the resistance of our communities and our families, and the will to survive and to narrate for our children and our descendants what happened, first of all, to name it. This happened. This is how it happened. This is what it meant. And then to counter the stories that are told in our own time, right? So in the previous panel, we were reflecting on the fact that it's not only the 20th anniversary of Meridians, but it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, as you're harkening back to, both of you, in your recounting of where we were then, right? It was 9/11. I remember, as I'm sure you all do, where I was when the bombs fell and students came rushing into my office, and I was, calling New York, the whole thing, right? And then the stunning rapidity with which the narrative was framed in the media, and then the consequences of that we've lived with, right, since then, and all the ways that the war on terror has been normalized and has structured a system of surveillance, a system of repression, and these both overt and covert everyday forms of violence against communities all over the world, right? Not just here in the United States, that are rejecting and refusing those frames. Both of you write about art, about visual art, about photography, about ceramic arts, about women who are the subjects of art and the objects of art, and how they use that space to reject those kinds of stories and frames and narratives, and to tell a different story. Could you walk us through that substantive part of each of your essays, and this question of the role that art plays specifically in producing a different archive, offering a different frame, embodying a different story?
I could go ahead and start, Ginetta, if that's okay. So I have to give a lot of credit to the tribal college system. And if listeners are unfamiliar, there's AHEC, American Indian Higher Education Consortium. There are 32 of these tribal colleges. I was able to attend the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was not only devoted to the practice, the studio practice of arts, but the world in which I fell into was a museum studies track. And we were doing things that were considered really radical at the time. I mean, now we have other frames for it. We call it post-custodial, and there was Echo Museum at one point. But in the early days, in the 80s, we were able to touch the objects, handle the objects, take them home to our dorm room and sleep with them if we wanted to, because the primacy was that we were relearning our cultures, and it was a space of possibility. And if I had not entered into that space and my tribal historian told me about this opportunity, then I think my trajectory would look really very different. So I already had a predisposition for this arena, but being part of that tribal college, which I'm still a part of. So look for Making History, IA Museum of Contemporary Native Art. We just finished that. It's 200 images that I don't think anyone's ever seen. So because I'm trained in cultural anthropology, I think once I get into a community, what I really value about that is the wholeness, the holisticness, and the embodiment of just establishing relationality. I went to school as a single parent. I hung out with other moms. We got close to each other, and my research was really tracking their lives over decades of period of time. And so it was that made me enter into their world, not necessarily arts, but this world of women with children who are making it. And it just so happens to be something that other people call art. And again, a little salience in Indigenous communities that I have noted is that the arts, it's almost like you can't even use the same word, because I had to make an argument recently for the inclusion of a MFA as being a terminal degree. And I ended up saying something along the lines of, like, there are doctors, there's lawyers. In our world, the artists are right there with the professionals, right? They are carrying our histories, our knowledge base, our intellectual systems. Like, this is a profession that has that status. And so those were the parameters of what led me into this world. And again, the feminism part, the part of what women can do, I think what I was trying to address in the article is this idea of how there is a term for gender that should properly only be seen as something that is a result of colonization, right? But that if you looked, and some people think this is utopian, again, separatist, but if you look at a knowledge system prior to genocide, prior to that like horrific ongoing crime of humanity on American soil, then you can see that there was a different understanding completely. That is something like complementarity, right? That is something like balance. That is something like a wholeness. And I think using the interviews I had taken, so I'm a real big advocate, and I still am, of oral histories. I'm working on American Indian activist oral histories at UCLA right now. If I didn't have Tessie Naranjo's words that I opened my essay with, where she says, I am female, my artwork is female, my home is female, my village is female. It's all about this. It's a matriarchal culture. I'm a part of it. I'm living it. That kept grounding me. Just this, I guess you'd call it like the testimony approach continues to be really key and central. And so writing the exercise of writing the essay, and Ginetta's right, the pre-tenure, post-tenure thing is very defining here. The eagerness to do it right and to, make the rapprochement that people want you to make. I couldn't have done it without those women's voices. So I guess the arts, it's not as though the arts aren't important, but I have to problematize art, I have to problematize gender, and I have to, even problematize, this whole framework of how those two intersect. And that can be burdensome for a reader.
Thank you, Nancy. Basuli?
Yeah, so, I'm going to the specifics of the essay. The argument I make is that, it's about the media being the cultural arm of imperialism. And I go to places like the National Geographic, but also 19th century European women's photography, and how the Muslim woman was portrayed by them. And the kind of discourse about the sister outsider, right? And the white woman's burden, that's very, very clearly laid out through the lens by these women. And then, there is a continuity between that kind of photography, which I trade, and the discourses during the War on Terror by first ladies in the United States, I believe, where else did I go to? Yes, in the UK. and also by other, like Condoleezza Rice is another person I bring in. And the fact that Laura Bush actually, in an unprecedented move, captured the microphone of the president and talked about how women from here need to go and liberate women and children in the Middle East through the war on terror, right? There is a kind of continuity between that kind of pictorial and oral discourse, which I trace, but then I go to a different kind of archive, particularly to the one of 181 photos by a woman from Spain, Lil Zara Mortada, during the uprising in Egypt. And I talk about an alternative manifesto, women's manifesto, which is very different. It's not done through that kind of system, like a systematic deliberation of manifestos, like the Communist Manifesto, which was burned and censored. I mean, this is something which was kind of beyond state control, because it could be so explosive and it could be disseminated so quickly because it was like social media photography. And then I trace. I propose that these manifestos, like there is a what is called the pictorial visual, right? The title of our panel, which is emerging through these, right? And one of it is that women will not be shamed or terrorized because of the vulnerabilities of their bodies into staying out of the public arena where distribution of political power is happening. The other is like what women wear has got nothing to do with what they can do. And the third is the inclusiveness of women's collectives where children, like even infants, aged, like the elderly, even men are included, as opposed to the kind of very demarcated space of the public space where women are excluded, right? So I mean, it's a manifesto which I trace through that pictorial visual, and then I basically from there I go to the figure of Alia Al-Mahdi, who posed nude online, and then she was hounded, and then later on went and joined the sex extremist group, Femin, and then there is this discourse which I talk about how Alia's figure is caught between Femin and the hardline thinkers at home from whom she fled under threat of life, and both trying to appropriate her body for their own agenda, right? I mean, it's a reiteration of an imperial feminist discourse in Femin again, and then the article ends with an alternative trajectory of thinking: how do we break out of this imperialist feminist mindset towards a transnational feminist mindset of solidarity? And I bring in Angela Davis' discussion in her Women, Culture and Politics book, 1985 or 1989, I believe, about her navigation of this very difficult terrain of female genital mutilation, when she went to Egypt, and how she navigated a terrain and really bring U.S. intersectional politics into conversation with transnational feminist politics to forge that kind of space for an anti-imperialist thinking. So that's more or less, and I think part of the title is moving from or cutting across imperialist feminism towards a transnational feminist politics. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you, Basuli. I appreciate you narrating the substance of the article and the really serious political and theoretical questions that your article engages with and walks us through and helps us think through, okay, exactly these questions. And you're reminding me of how I ended my introduction to the reader by quoting Maria Lugones, who passed away and who I was thinking with and about as I was writing my intro. And so what you've just said inspires me to ask her questions, ask Maria Lugones' questions on her behalf for our purposes as the next part of our conversation. So Maria Lugones has asked, how do we learn about each other? How do we do it without harming each other, but with the courage to take up a weaving of the everyday that may reveal deep betrayals? How do we cross without taking over? With whom do we do this work? How do we practice with each other, engaging in dialogue about colonial difference? How do we know we are doing it? And it seems to me like that these are the questions that we're grappling with. And I'm going to ask you to think about those questions, right? Because you're both really asking those same questions in your work, right? How do we cross without taking over? How do we engage in the work of solidarity without reproducing the violence of these legacies of imperialist feminisms, of settler colonial feminisms? So I'm going to ask you to say some more about that, and perhaps to then maybe think about, does Meridians offer a space for doing that work, for thinking through those terms? I mean, these are the terms, feminism, race, transnationalism. Are we doing it? Are we missing it? Where are we?
Yeah. Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you for those prompts. I need to reread your introduction and think about this more. But as we're all talking, I'm reflecting on kind of a framework, and again, it's purely Indigenous studies infused, that is about the white imagination. And I think early on in my research, I had to make a decision about where am I going to really invest my efforts, given our historical trajectories of imprisonment and of genocide. There's only so many people to do so much work. And I realized that the contribution I could make was less with the white imagination. And I'm using whiteness not as a racial category, but as a philosophical category. Anyone can occupy that category. Despite what marginalized background you might come from, you can still enact those things. And then the Native imagination, and I decided very concertedly, even though I'm interested in what many people call stereotypes, I call conventional narratives. So the thesis of the 2009 book, Our Indian Princess, I was looking at an old theory by Robert Burkhofer that basically premises that images of Native people do tell you nothing about their realities. It just tells you about the white imagination. And I inverted that to see if I'm interested in the Native imagination, then is that true? Like, are images that Natives make of whites, and again, these are categories that I'm thinking about expansively, do they also mirror that? And they do. They're more about the Native imagination, and they're similarly not complex, one-dimensional, easily consumable things. And so I look at how economic environments where you're competing for scarce resources activate these one-dimensional derogatory images, and that in turn is like a communication tool. So I was kind of playing around with that idea of art as communication in that instance. And I think now we've got a lot that we have to be very optimistic about. I'm thinking of, in terms of political movements in our communities, the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement, the water protector movement, the Red Nation movement. I mean, there are lots of things happening, and yet the arts with a new generation, I see a bit of a struggle to discern between what you are doing to educate someone else who is really unwilling to be educated. This is a willful ignorance. I did a study in museums with a cognitive scientist where our findings were that people who come in to learn about Native people in a museum, which many people do, actually reinforce the entrance narrative. They actually come out more biased afterwards, not less biased. And so many artists now are saying, if we just make more, if there's just more of us, if we get more out there, if we're seen, if we're visible, if we have voice, that it'll change everything. And that equation is not functioning. And so I guess my concern is, how do we keep alive this idea of liberation and liberation through the arts as a means of occupying political space, and yet not fall into the trap of this burden of, I have to help the museum, I have to help the unversed audience, I have to lead them through it. You know, for my energy and for the energy of my students, I don't want them to do that. Other people can do that, and actually it's wasted energy often, you know. And so kind of moving the conversation into this, again, generative futuristic space of, let's just get healthy. Let's just make some things that are meaningful for our communities. Unless these institutions, including academic institutions, want to actually ask living communities, what do you need and how can we help you? Then it's not really worth our time to try to redeem them. Like it's irretrievable in many cases. So I don't mean that to be pessimistic, but realistic.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really valuable political perspective. Thank you, Nancy. Basuli?
Yeah, the way I look at it, coalition work is hard. And there is no way we will be able to be in the exact same space as the culture of the other. Culture that way is inaccessible. And what I think the only way forward is to, from all sides, to understand that there will be mistakes. And then it is important to be vulnerable to making mistakes, and also vulnerable to seeing mistakes and communicating and strategizing with comrades who've made those mistakes and who have probably heard us, right, in the process. But for that kind of solidarity work to go forward, I think that, we just need to be open. Otherwise, I have come back very hurt and very pained from solidarity work. And I have to say this, particularly those situations have come when I've been working with men, and sometimes these are very alpha male who are trying to unlearn and relearn with the best of intentions, and they fall down and they say, I did fall down. But then, for me, then I'm like, okay, why did you fall down? But, right, because as it is, you come with so much privilege, I should be the one to fall down, not you. But then, I learned from that hurt and pain and that grieving process, right, that the only way forward for this person and for me in this kind of productive work is for me to communicate with that person about how that made me feel, and also my vulnerabilities about the fact that I learned that instead of, it's okay to be angry, but then you can't stay in that space, because then the work doesn't move forward, right? There's no communication. There's a complete shutting down, because I don't want to work with you anymore, because I will again feel that pain. So I think, that's for me is, an answer to many of the questions, right? And then your specific question about, race, feminism, race, and transnationalism, right? The Meridian subtitle. The way I look at it is Meridians is one of the very few places which is bringing U.S. paradigms of intersectional politics into conversation with of course, indigeneity, but also more than that, I think transnational feminism and intersectional feminism and often indigenous feminism are they often don't gel very well. And I think that's the work which Meridians is doing, in addition to something else which I want to talk about later. But that's more of a tribute to. But I very honestly, it's one of the very few platforms which bring immigrant scholars and people working from within the United States and native-born scholars together in a shared platform for that kind of solidarity politics. And that also will come with hurt and pain, but I think for me that the process is moving forward through that hurt and pain and anger.
Basuli, thank you. And I'm going to, because we have about 5 minutes left, and there is a question from the audience that I'm going to go ahead and ask, but I want to make sure that you do have the opportunity to say the other thing that you alluded to saying. So this might be a good moment, and then I'll ask Nancy. The question is for you in the questions. Basuli, would you like to do that now?
Yeah. I think I'm going to, it's a tribute. So I want to, be very precise with my words, and I want to read it out. I was going through Ginetta Candelario's editor's introduction and her reference to Elijah McClain's cardiac arrest in August 2019. And this is a personal reflection on Meridians over the years. Arrest in August 2019 after being subjected to the chokehold by the Colorado police. And this is for me, it made me think. For me, the history of Meridians is a history of addressing chokeholds on multiple levels. Samantha Tello's cover art, Silenced Voices of Everyday Sheroes, says a lot. Chokeholds try not only to silence feminist voices, but also snuff out feminist livelihoods and feminist lives. And chokeholds operate within academia as well. And not just at the level of the administration, but within women's and gender studies departments, and even women's gender and sexuality studies departments. I have personally been subjected to that chokehold by the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as a transnational feminist of color from South Asia, writing about the participation of women soldiers in the Abu Ghraib torture and their specific torture methods. For me, that is the key work that Meridians is doing, reviving silenced voices and guarding against that silencing in the future. That is very clear to me from the powerful voices of women of color that Meridians has drawn out from its 20-year archive, and also from President Ruth Simon's keynote yesterday about the foundational history of Meridians. The message Meridians is sending out is very powerful and very stern, that chokeholds will not work. Chokeholds will not selectively snuff out feminist lives of women of color, and academic brutality needs to be abolished.
Basuli, you're going to make me cry, and I cry a lot, but I try not to cry on camera. So, but
I do it all the time. Go ahead and cry.
Tears of gratitude. That's really powerful. Thank you so much for picking up on that thread of my narrating the horrors of last year as part of just making sure that they were memorialized as part of the context in which the reader was being put together, and this celebration of 20 years of Meridians was being worked on, and just really wanting to document those losses, to call their names, and to do so in the context of a small, tiny attempt in the world to, as you say, remember and give voice and reimagine, right? And to I think reaffirm, because we can feel so disheartened. We can just feel so disheartened in the context of all of this, but we try really hard to inspire ourselves to keep going on and to sustain the kind of radical hope that I think each one of us has as part of what drives us forward. So Nancy, I do want to give you an opportunity. Thank you again, Basuli, truly. I appreciate very much.
Thank you.
Nancy, I'd like to turn it to you, and we're kind of a little bit of time, so I apologize. I'm not going to ask the question out loud because I want to give you an opportunity to offer final reflections, if you'd like to.
I'm just so moved by these powerful testimonies, guys, and so honored to be a part of it. And Basuli, thank you for talking about the problems of us, working together and coalition building, and giving me hope for that. And I'll just say, Ginetta, I'm so excited to have my soul sister with me again. And I think about you often, and your children and your family. I wanted to shout out the name of Liz Hansen, who was the managing editor at Meridians in its early days, and I know gave so much love and light to that, and how I was so inspired by really kind of witnessing what was going on with the birth of the journal. So I'm looking forward to this new Indigenous issue that you mentioned yesterday, Ginetta. There's an edited volume coming out on indigeneity. That's great. If I can help with any of that, I'm offering my services.
Now you're roped in, because I've been thinking I need to have someone as a guest co-editor, because I'm trying to curate it, you know, from
or one of those invisible readers. Okay, just put me wherever you want to put me.
Now you're going to be my guest editor for it, because I'm really thinking to Basuli's point. Also, I'm framing it globally as Indigenous feminisms globally, and really thinking about Palestine, for example, and thinking about New Zealand, and thinking about Indonesia, and places from which specifically framed as Indigenous feminist political action and theorizing and scholarship and art making are happening across the world, right? As a kind of broader decolonial sovereignty in its most radical sense, rather than its nationalist sense, futuristic vision, right? So that is what we're hoping to offer to our readers. So Nancy, you've just been volunteering.
Oh no, and I did it on air. Ginetta, I'll just say something really quickly. Ginetta was always so good, like a big sister at Smith College who knew where the resources were. Whether it was just like, that house next door is giving out free food tonight. Let's take the kids. You know,
what you learn when you grow up on welfare in the United States is figure out where the cheese line is. Okay.
We'll continue to hold each other up.
That's right. We're still, trying to find where the good stuff is being distributed. Thank you both again for uplifting us, for sharing your wisdom and your candor, your sincerity, your hearts with us today. And as always, your brilliance. I really appreciate it. I want to encourage folks who are watching us live or watch us subsequently, because we recorded immediately, to please read these texts, read the 20th anniversary reader, read Meridians if you have access to it. If you don't, let us know. We'll figure out a way to get you some access. And to join us for our next panel, which will start in 8 minutes. We'll have a little bit of a breather, but at 1 o'clock promptly, we're going to start with our Proud, Black, Beautiful, and Free Organizing for Justice panel, featuring Crystal Brent Zook, a professor of journalism who documented an incredible labor organizing movement in the Mississippi Delta, and Kamala Price, professor of women's studies at San Diego State, who takes up the reproductive justice movement, and our incredible moderator, longtime friend of Meridians, and former faculty member, brief faculty member at Smith, Adrienne Lentz-Smith, who's now at Duke University. And we're so jealous they have it. Perhaps, maybe one day we'll get her back. But in the meantime, she's on the editorial advisory board. So join us at 1 o'clock for that. And thank you both again. Much love to you all.
Thank you.